Conoce las historias de las personas que son parte del cambio para proteger nuestro planeta. Esto es Sustentablemente. Conversaciones que inspiran. Un podcast original de Radio Pauta. Con Carolina Escobar.
Thank you so much for tuning again on Sustentablemente podcast. And today I'm saluting you not from Santiago, Chile, as usually, but from Atlanta, Georgia. You may ask why? Well, just because around these days, we're celebrating the International Bee Day, and we have a great example here on urban beehives. Have you ever asked what are the best plants, for instance, for a bee to survive or do they drop? Are all bees the same? Do we need to protect more one than others? Well, Brian Barnes is here today with us. Thank you, Brian.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. To answer those questions, and we're going to be talking about a lot more things. Brian, why don't you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Brian Barnes. I'm the Director of Operations and Volunteer Programs at the Chastain Park Conservancy. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that seeks to make Chastain Park a better place.
Wonderful. And we're in the middle. For those that don't know Atlanta or not familiar with the area, we're in the middle of the city of Atlanta,
Absolutely.
Capital of Georgia, the state of Georgia, in the south of the U.S. so that you can locate where we are.
Yes, we're in the southeast.
Why do I have a honeybee container here with me with a wonderful honey in it?
So this is Chastain Park honey that was grown right here behind us from, well, I should say the bees did the work.
Yeah.
We have a beekeeper that harvests the honey and he keeps the bees here. And it is all from plants that are locally pollinated by these honeybees and harvested into this jar. And that's why it's Chastain Park honey.
And then, Brian, a lot of people may think, and especially after the Bee movie, for instance, where you remember he was suing the humankind for getting the honey from them. Are there those bees, honeybees, in danger? Are those our main focus nowadays? And I'm talking here about restoration and wildlife.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question because I think sometimes the idea of saving the bees on planet Earth can get a little bit foggy for some people, and there's misconceptions around it. I'm no tremendous expert, but I have an opinion about it for sure, and I've got some research that I've learned from over the past years that I'd love to share with you guys today. So, when people talk about saving the bees, the first thing that comes to mind, especially here in the United States, is about honeybees, because those are the bees that people actually interact with. They eat honey. Everyone knows what honey is, and everyone knows that they come from bees. But not all bees make honey that human beings harvest. Most honeybees, like these ones behind us that we use in the United States, are not native to the United States. They're native to Eurasia, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Turkey, that kind of part of the world. And they're brought to the United States for a purpose, to actually make something that we can enjoy. There's other purposes that people use bees for as well. Recently people have been using honeybees to pollinate crops. Beekeepers will come to a farm, like an almond farm, let's say in California, crops that really need a high rate of pollination, and they'll let their bees loose, their honeybees loose, in the orchard or in the farm to increase pollination, to increase food production, nut production or fruit, whatever the crop is actually growing. So those bees perform a service, and the beekeeper gets the pollination, and the pollen turns into honey in the beehives. However, this is almost like a livestock kind of process. There are hundreds of species of bees that are native to the United States of America that get absolutely forgotten in most people's eyes when we're thinking about saving the bees. Honeybees, because they're livestock essentially, are not endangered in the United States of America. They have a tremendous population. However, the native bees that have existed here for thousands and thousands of years, that have evolved here over the same amount of time, are the ones that are being critically at risk of species going extinct or at risk of being extinct. And part of why that is happening is because nobody thinks about those bees when we're thinking about saving the bees. And those types of bees need totally different kinds of support than just keeping bees or buying sustainably grown honey. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I would love to elaborate on that.
Well, yes, I'd love to, because when you think about them, we've seen both bumblebees and bees, for instance, coexist, right?
Absolutely.
But what is the main focus that we should have in that case? And not only for, we're here in the States, so for Native American bees that I guess are different on this side of the country than on the West Coast.
Absolutely.
But also the same situation goes for different areas of the world where there are the typical or the native bees in that country, or even in that area in different parts of the same country.
Exactly. So, bringing honeybees that are native to Eurasia to Asia or the United States or Australia is really not going to do a whole lot for the species that are actually extinct. Mm-hmm. So if we are going to try and support the species that are at risk of being lost forever, what we need to do is find out what those bees need in the natural world. Mm-hmm. And from my understanding, what those bees need is the plants that they have co-evolved with over the thousands and thousands of years that they've been in existence. And a lot of those plants are not the typical plants that you think of when you think about bees and pollination. People think about wildflowers and clover and different things that are being marketed as supporting pollinators. However, native bees that are native to the United States, especially the East Coast, need particular plants that they've co-evolved with over thousands and thousands of years, and those are strictly native plants. Native plants are not clovers, they're not zinnias, they're not in the typical wildflower mixes that we see marketed for supporting pollinators.
And then, Brian, are those native plants something that necessarily you think of a bee and you think of a flower?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could this be a tree? Could this be a plant that not necessarily have a particular big flower?
Absolutely. That is a great question. Trees provide some of the most support for bees and wildlife in general, particularly insects. Trees like sycamore trees or oak trees that are sort of in the background behind us provide a lot of that support because they have a multitude of flowers. Whereas we talk about a flower that we plant in our garden only has maybe a few, so it is a small impact in relative terms that those kind of plants can have. However, they are extremely important nonetheless.
Definitely, but will that give like a better place to start with to the honeybees if we promote those plants, those flowers, for instance, in our yard than, for example, the trees? Absolutely.
So a focus on trees is absolutely tremendous because of how much support they provide pollinators and other insects that are endangered. It doesn't matter if it's the United States of America or Asia or India or Africa,
South
wherever.
America.
Exactly, yeah. South America, right, totally. Trees are, because they're so big, they do provide a lot of that support. But what I would love to talk about is how a lot of people, as they're planting things that are seen as good for pollinators or good for wildlife that are not native to that local area, they could be actually doing a disservice to bees at the same time, because a lot of plants that are planted in places they're not native to can become invasive. And when they become invasive, they actually take the space that the native plants can be using to grow and actually support the insects that need support from those plants.
And then I would assume those plants that are not natural to that area could, of course, have a longer life term because they're not, they don't get adjusted, or all the opposite, they can just take it all. And even though we've said many times that in nature, different species coexist and that diversity is wonderful, not necessarily in this case.
Right, exactly. And we have to be very conscious of our impact in the environment as human beings. We tend to see it as something that we have the power to mold and to make our own. We are just as much a part of nature as a bee is. So it's important for us to observe and really understand what wildlife needs and how we can actually make a positive impact, and not just think quickly about, I would love to plant some beautiful flowers and I know they're great for bees. We've had loads of invasive species introduced to the United States for the purpose of supporting wildlife, but the research wasn't quite there yet. So a lot of those plants, as they were being planted, like let's say Elaeagnus, like autumn olive, is one that has taken over this park that we've done a lot of work to try and beat back. That plant was installed in the early 1920s in order to actually provide habitat for wildlife. But it's native to, again, Eurasia. So it actually just grows unchecked, and it doesn't provide the wildlife support that the plants that are being overtaken by those species of plants can use. So as we're planting these non-native plants, we're stealing essentially the space that could be used to grow native plants. Go ahead. Oh, I was gonna say it's so interesting because as we're losing native bees, native plants are not able to reproduce as quickly either, because honeybees don't generally pollinate native plants. They pollinate the plants that are native to Eurasia, like white clover.
Or to them, right?
Exactly, that's what I mean. Exactly. So those plants are the ones that are pollinated by honeybees. So they're creating a lot of seed. And that seed gets distributed, across the landscape very prolifically. However, as we're losing the native bees, those native bees, because they're so few in number and declining as we speak, those bees aren't able to pollinate the native plants. So those native plants aren't producing as much seed, as much fruit. They're not able to distribute themselves across the landscape as they once were. So we're actually, as we're losing the native bees, we're losing the ability of native plants to survive and reproduce on their own. Additionally, honeybees or bees that are not native to the United States can proliferate invasive plants because those non-native insects or non-native bees pollinate plants like Elaeagnus or kudzu, which has absolutely swallowed the South. That is allowing those plants to get a leg up in terms of their reproduction. So it is actually causing a huge crisis and causing so much more damage to install bees and plants that are not native to this area. It's all just at the detriment of the native wildlife.
Well, and you know what? Now that you mentioned, for those that don't know, for instance, what kudzu is, I don't know all the names that he mentioned, but if you would see those movies like, in Spanish was La Cosa, the thing, that would just eat up everything, right? Kudzu here has done kind of like the same. If you go anywhere, Atlanta is a really green city, beautiful. But kudzu has been like taken over. It's an ivy that takes over trees. I mean, the whole thing, it's kind of like you put a blanket on everything else that was wild there before. And Brian, it's been so interesting, and we don't have that much time left.
Of course.
But I'd love to just, there are some concepts that we speak, us that are within the subject of sustainability and regeneration, but not everybody needs to know what it really means or the importance of it. So if you could tell us why wildlife is just so, we take it for granted, like, oh yeah, sure, wildlife is so important.
Of course.
But why? For instance, in places where, not the case in Atlanta, but you've got droughts for a long time, what is the importance of keeping that wildlife instead of invasive plants like kudzu, we were talking?
Oh gosh, yes.
I know, and I know I'm not giving you a lot of time to answer that.
No, but I love that question, and I would just say that the wildlife that exists in Northeast United States is critical for all of the animals that are in our ecosystem. If we didn't have an ecosystem, we wouldn't be able to survive. There would be no trees. If we had no more bees to pollinate or insects that pollinate trees, the trees would no longer be able to reproduce themselves. And after so long, we wouldn't have trees anymore. And of course, you're familiar with the heat island effect. What would happen if we had no trees? There would be no carbon sequestration. There would be, it would be absolutely blazing hot all over the place. We'd probably encounter a lot of desertification, inability to grow food, and it would become inhospitable to human beings. So we would be lost as well. So we are intrinsically tied to the survival of wildlife and all of planet Earth. And it's not just about the native plants and native insects and wildlife in Southeast United States, but all over the world. And it's really important for us to understand what is native to our area and make sure that we are supporting that type of wildlife rather than trying to play God, essentially, and bring things back and forth to different places because we think personally that they're the best. It's all about research and understanding and observing what nature is doing.
I love it. And you know what? I love to end our conversation with that quote and the fact that we need to respect what is going on with nature and just keep on following them and observing a lot.
Of course.
Brian, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. And of course, we will keep on with this subject about what is going on here at the Chastain Park, what's going on around the world, and with great initiatives and great information like Brian has just given us. So see you next time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Sure.
See you next time.
Escuchaste conversaciones que inspiran y nos invitan a tomar acción en el cuidado de nuestro planeta. Esto fue Sustentablemente, junto a Carolina Escobar, un podcast original de Radio Pauta.